Welcome to Data BS, a show dedicated to tackling the big questions impacting the world of data and ML/AI without any of the BS. My name is James Winegar. Each week I sit down with guests from across the data ecosystem to unpack how they're shaping their businesses or the businesses of others through the real-world application of data engineering, ML/AI, infrastructure, analytics, and more. No fluff, unfiltered, but slightly edited to remove noise. This is Data BS. Let's get into it.
All right, Matt. So tell me who you are and what do you do?
Hey, James. Matt Barlow, and I work at StratusGrid. I'm a cloud infrastructure lead. We have a product called Stratosphere, which is a multi-account FinOps product that helps you kind of optimize your cloud costs. And then we also have a consulting segment of the business, and that's what I work in. I'm a long-term consultant engineer for platform engineering teams. So that's pretty much it for me in a nutshell. I've been working with cloud, AWS, DevOps related type work for many years now. So I'm really excited to be here and to talk about how AI is influencing some of the work that we do on platform and DevOps type of teams.
We've worked together on a few customers, and so that's how we know each other. And you've really taken, Gen AI into your workflow. And so that's why we're talking, is to talk about Matt as a DevOps platform engineer, etc., the wearer of 20 hats. I know that y'all are an AWS partner, so there's a lot of bedrock going on for, the stuff that you're doing. But what specific Gen AI tools are you integrating into your workflow that have impacted your day-to-day productivity?
For the agent type of work, I've been using Cloud Engineer and Claude quite a bit, and mostly on Bedrock and directly from Anthropic APIs. But for my day-to-day work, I'm really using a mix of different models. So I'm using the O1 Preview, GPT-4, Claude on Bedrock, and Claude from Anthropic, and other tools that are wrapping those models.
It's just like from a compliance viewpoint, you've made sure that all those tools are approved. And for the vast majority of the work you do, you're not really sending customer information or data over anyways. You're just like, how do I do this like AWS command line call and help me write a little program that does this stuff?
Yeah, for that type of work, everything is pretty much sanitized, right? I mean, that's the way that I like to work. I've played around with a lot of the code completion tools. I've used Copilot, I've used Cursor, but especially for customer work, I'm not using code completion, even though those tools are approved at some of the places that I work. But mostly the way that I like to use the chat interface is if I'm stuck on something, to come up with a generic question and get a response back to help me move forward. So yeah, that's the way that I'm using it. Now, for people that want to actually use Gen AI for agent type work or things that are going to involve business related data, then Bedrock is definitely the way to go.
At least within the environments you're working in, because it's got your compliance approval. It's not leaving, your data ecosystem stays within VPC plus minus.
Yeah, it could stay within the VPC, and you can fine tune the models, which creates a copy of the model in your account as well. That's just dedicated to you.
So in your experience, what are the main efficiency gains from using Gen AI in like the DevOps or platform engineer role, particularly with processes like containerization or infrastructure automation?
So I would say the first kind of efficiency gains are, you kind of alluded to it earlier, that when you're working in these types of roles, you're working with many different code bases and a lot of different scripting and APIs. And it's in a given day, you might, work on a dozen projects and different types of tools. So I think the first thing is Gen AI can help people just to be able to write the scripts and troubleshoot things that they may not be working with every day. So that seems to be important. But in terms of taking it to the next step with things like containerization, it's really helpful in terms of being able to diagnose build issues and help you get past dependency problems or other issues that you might be facing when trying to work on those things. What I'm really excited about, and I think we'll talk about in a little bit, is how it can augment your automation in terms of like trying to modernize or to go to end-to-end containerization of an application. How there's certain things that can be automated pretty cleanly, but there's other things that require some human intervention. And I think Gen AI has a lot of opportunity to help us with those. Tech companies that have been around for a while, especially if they have larger engineering organizations, there's always going to be some sort of modernization effort going on. I mean, this particular customer has over 1,000 GitHub repositories. And there's just, over a dozen teams that are constantly churning out services and new services and microservices. And what's going to happen over time is that there's kind of legacy patterns. And working on a platform team like I do, what we want to do is the best job that we can in getting everybody onto consistent tooling and patterns. So in terms of CloudFormation and Terraform and Pulumi and so on, I think that's kind of the evolution of a platform, of the direction that we're going in DevOps and platform related teams. Is now we sort of think as the platform as like a product and the development teams are our customers. So we're really thinking in things in more terms of product development and using like a real programming language, like with CDK or Pulumi. It's going to enable you to develop or to create a product that is going to be more maintainable and extensible and avoid some of the annoyances with Terraform.
So really, it's not just about like the tools that we thought about. It's like the transition from a declarative format into a code-driven format, where, you're writing, TypeScript or something like that. And so because you have like this actual programming language that's defining everything, you can create modules that are much, much more extensible than they were with like a DSL. So DSLs were really, really good for getting started, but like as the scope of the operation has increased, then the need for these kind of like extensible patterns increases. So, DSL is a great place to start. And then as your organization evolves, getting into more of a code-driven infrastructure as code framework.
Yeah, just to give you a couple of specific examples, this really comes into play when you're dealing with many, many consumers of the modules that you're creating. So typically on a platform team, you're going to be writing the automation and the reusable modules that people are using to build their services. And once you have hundreds of people using that module, then you start to hit some of the limitations of things like the declarative languages that you're talking about. Like, for example, in Terraform, if you're writing a Terraform module and you want to only allow a certain combination of inputs, that's difficult to do in Terraform. And typically what you see people is adding comments and things like that. But when you're using something like TypeScript, you can do interfaces, which only enable certain combinations of inputs into the module. So you prevent people from getting to the apply stage and they can see it like in the editor as they're using the module that something's going to be an invalid combination. So that's one reason why the switch to TypeScript and Pulumi has been beneficial for us in a larger engineering organization.
Yeah, and I just happen to know, but there was like, hundreds of modules that y'all supported and things like that. So that's a very non-trivial effort in terms of like the platform engineering team to go through that migration. I'm not sure it's even 100% done still. It's mostly done though. And so how did you and your team leverage Gen AI in that process of migrating from, there was still some CloudFormation even left over when you started on it. And so you have this CloudFormation and Terraform DSL, and you're migrating that into Pulumi's development kit.
Yeah, I would say that Gen AI, for all of the people on the team, has the greatest kind of lift that it gives us is helping people get familiar with TypeScript. So for a lot of people that work in roles like I do, typically you're using Python a lot and Go. TypeScript is more of like a full stack. So unless you're doing back-end engineering, you typically don't have a lot of exposure to it. So I think that Gen AI is really helpful in helping you to get up to speed on a new language. In terms of like the modernization effort itself, we tried to automate as much of it as possible because we had, dozens of services to migrate. And what we do, we use Backstage as well. So that kind of kicks off our automation process. We have these modules, that we've written in Pulumi. We can create a pull request on a service repository and even run the Pulumi code itself and build a lot of the infrastructure. But one place where we kept getting stuck was on the containerization phase. There's really two steps that are difficult to automate. So the first part is once you have the repo created, you can make your best guess at like a Docker file, but it's probably not going to build on the first try. And then the second part is when you actually go to deploying the containers, there's going to be debugging that goes on, right? So I was really interested to know if Gen AI could assist with those because when you can automate pretty much like the modernization of a service from end to end, but you have 2 points that are semi-manual. I was curious if Gen AI could help with that. And we didn't actually use it on this project, but it did lead me down the path of trying to evaluate agents for that scenario. So what I did was started working with some of the software engineering agents that are out there and tested out like containerization on about 6 different code projects that were in different kind of states of working. And I learned a lot from doing that, and was able to finally get to the point where the agent could reliably containerize these 6 different applications.
Yeah, could you talk about like what the differences between these 6 were? Because it sounds like you picked 6 because they were different enough. Was it like a Go app and a TypeScript app?
Yeah, different languages and different types of projects. So one of them was like a full stack front end and back end application. The other ones were services, and then there were mixtures of languages, and then there were different things that were broken about them. Like one of them had a dependency issue. So I wanted to see if the agent could actually solve some of the issues that we would see during an actual migration.
Did it manage to get through that?
Yes, it did manage to get through it. But this is where it gets interesting, because what I found was using like the software engineering agents that they're designed for a very broad use case, where you can pretty much just ask it to build or do anything. And I was really excited the first time that I saw it starting to run shell commands, but your bill's going to go up really quickly because it's going to be making a lot of the same mistakes. And it's sort of like watching somebody and you're thinking, wow, it took you 10 steps to do that, but you could have just done it in 2. I also noticed that they were making the same mistakes over and over again. So that's what led me down the path of trying to update the prompt templates, which in the tools that I was using at the time, it required modifying the source code because there wasn't a way to actually change the prompt templates or the sandbox environment that it was running in. So I've kind of moved past that, and I've got a better way of doing that now. But that's what I kind of learned in that. And I started updating the prompt templates, and then that's what enabled it to get past things like the peer dependency issues. So do I know 100% was I over optimizing it? Maybe I was, but it was an interesting project, and I learned some good stuff from it.
We talked about, just kind of like general purpose Gen AI, like ask a question, get an answer, use that to help get you unstuck in a piece of your workflow. Because a given day, you probably got 10, 15 different things going on, right? How do you see the role of these AI agents evolving in DevOps? Because that's where you can actually get some of that like iteration cycle in. And then also these manual tasks, like, that we were talking about with like containerization.
That's really what I'm interested in next, is building agents that are kind of tightly scoped to particular use cases. So that kind of reminds me of when we started working with cloud, for example, and creating scripts and things for repeated tasks that we had to do. There was a place where I was working where even before the cloud came out, we were managing tens of thousands of Red Hat servers, and a lot of them were running Apache. And every time we log into a server, it was a new environment, and we would be running the same commands over and over again. So we started writing scripts so that we could basically like kind of take the tribal knowledge and put it together, and then every time you logged in, it would run through these 20 or 30 different checks. So I see a lot of opportunity for AI agents in the same way. And this gets back to kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of being able to tune the prompt templates. So there's really, when you're working with the agents, I think it's important to be able to have these templates for different types of tasks, and to be able to combine maybe some procedural code with the LLM related code, and also to be able to have some control over the sandbox environment. So let me talk through that a little bit more. So what I'm getting at is, like, if I'm working on something that's like an incident, I'm going to be following same kinds of steps every time. Like, I'm going to be checking Datadog or New Relic. I'm going to be looking at AWS resources. I'm going to look for any recent commits that happened, what was pushed to production. And what's interesting is that I may be on a call with other people that do the same job that I do, but we may all approach it differently, and we may forget a step, So where I think like this starts to become powerful is that we can have like an AI agent that we know that we're going to need these 10 pieces of data, from all these different providers. So can we just write a script that grabs that at once and then maybe summarizes it, looks for insights, and provides us with some data to help us with incident response? So that's kind of the direction that I'm interested in going. I already do this for a lot of like ad hoc scripts and things that I need to write. For example, if I'm asked to do like an IAM role audit, and there's thousands of IAM roles, and I need to audit the policies in each one, rather than just opening up my editor and kind of starting from scratch, or even using something like ChatGPT, I have an agent that has a template that states exactly how I like my scripts to be written, using TypeScript, being executable with a bun runtime, and every other instruction that I have in there, so that I could just tell it what I want, and it creates the script exactly the way that I want it. So this is where I think the real power starts to come into play, is the ability to set those prompt templates and to combine it with things like, if you wanted to do a pull request review, that's procedural, grab the data related to the pull request and then do the analysis of it. That's what I'm kind of excited about.
One of the things I'm thinking about on the client that we both work on, one of the reasons I get called in is shit's hit the fan on like a database, right? And almost always I'm like, go grab these 5 pieces of information. Based off the outputs of those 5, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 other ones, or I'm going to be like, oh, it's this.
Something related to that I've been playing with the past couple of weeks is having custom tools that are designed for this work. So typically the agent that I've been using recently is Cloud Engineer, which has been a really great project to work with, but it's not designed in a way that's really extensible. It's not packaged or anything, but it's really easy to clone and get started with it and make changes. And all of these agents have a lot of tools like Tavily Search or a bash tool. But what I've been interested in lately is writing tools specific to infrastructure work. So like the first one that I wrote was a service registry tool, which basically told the agent, if you need information about a service or you need to list all services, then, call this function. So then I could ask the agent questions like, what is the login command for the ECS task for service ABC? And then it could basically pull the metadata out for the service and then do a resource lookup and get me back the ARN and other information that I need to run that command. So I think what you're talking about, I want to keep exploring that. Like, it would be interesting to have these tools related to data as well for the agents to say, like, how do you check resource utilization? How do you check IO? So that the agent can kind of like make decisions in terms of what tool it wants to use in order to get the data that it needs.
Yeah, I'm kind of less hype on agents because I think that it requires so much context, and like that context is usually like very dependent. So to your point, all right, you're writing these like functions that like go call into, your service registry to extract some metadata. That required you to have like a service registry. Is the service registry for your client going to be the same as, some other client or, some other company? Probably not. Like, you could say, oh, this works for AWS, but it might not work for Azure. This works for Azure and might not work for Google Cloud, or, it's like kind of, very subsetting in terms of like how it behaves. And then also kind of like chains of agents, right? Like if you like really dig into like a workflow and you're like, send an email, like there's a lot of steps in sending an email. Like if you really try to break it down into like what an agent needs to do. So there's like this planning, like this meta planning requirement that's there. And so, do you have a separate LLM or that like is supporting like meta planning? But there's like often hallucinations, especially when you have this like very, structured thing that you're trying to get to at the end of the day. So do you have approved sets of plans based off the workflow? And then it's like a search engine against these approved sets of plans. I think that like our kind of viewpoint typically is like the more focused of a problem statement you have, the more valuable Gen AI can be.
Yeah.
So if you're fine with cutting it up and subsetting it to where it's like for this particular thing in this particular environment, it can work really well. But this, these general purpose, AGI. I'm not very bullish on AGI. I think we got a lot more compute necessary to kind of get to that point.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Like any attempt that I've made to use agents to kind of break down a problem and then create, sub agents, and then they report back to the agent that's kind of tracking the project overall, it always seems to fall apart. It's just, I haven't seen anything practical come from that. But to address your comment about the implementation of like these different services for infra-related work, I think that's a really good point. And what I've been doing in Cloud Engineer is I write the agent tools, but the actual functions that are being invoked are, it's like a strategy pattern. So basically like the function itself is implemented separately that actually pulls the service registry data, so that if you did want to implement it for different customers in different environments, that you only have to work on the implementation piece, like the agent code itself wouldn't change.
So let's kind of switch gears, because I think like we've been talking about like how you leverage the tools, but like let's talk about what is changing for people as a consequence of this tool. So what are the risks of actually relying on Gen AI, especially for the juniors on their team, and how can your team mitigate these risks?
Well, that's a good question. The risks, two of them stand out. One of them is just the fact that usually when you're working on something like a platform team, you have elevated access, right? So you have to be very careful about what you're running and making sure that you understand it thoroughly. And you definitely don't want an agent running shell commands on your behalf when you have credentials, keys to the kingdom, right? So that's something you have to be careful of. But aside from that, also, it really gets down to being able to understand what's being produced before you implement it or run it. Like, for example, if you are responsible for request routing rules, like for something like Cloudflare that makes heavy use of regex, then it could be really tempting to use something like GPT to generate regex rules for you. But do you really understand what's happening? Like, what if there's another rule that kind of shadows your rule, Or, what if you don't understand how it's being written and it could cause like an outage, So I think relying on it without understanding it is a big issue. And kind of the other issue that I see is people using it for code completion when they don't understand the code that's being completed. It can be so tempting because we're all under, I know you are and all of us are under so much pressure to deliver. And if you're using something like Cursor and you're kind of tab completing through a bunch of code without necessarily understanding it, but just you get it to compile or it works and it seems like it's working, then you're not really doing yourself any favors because you're not learning how it's actually implemented, So I think that can be an issue. That's why I kind of prefer the approach that I mentioned earlier, which is if you're new to something like TypeScript and you're writing a Pulumi component and you don't understand how to do something, then just, think about the question that you want to ask and make a generic request to something like GPT to get the response back and then fit that into your code rather than just having the editor write it all for you.
For people interested in learning more about this stuff, can you share any recommended resources, blogs, projects where people can see these types of things in action?
Like I mentioned earlier, I would recommend Cloud Engineer as a good place to start for learning how to evaluate agents on your own, on your own projects to see if it's working for you. And so what I'd recommend is basically cloning the Cloud Engineer repository and using it as it's designed, but then also customizing it according to different use cases that you have. I think that just getting started with it is about experimentation. Like when I started working on this, I was using LangChain. I tried writing my own custom software engineering agents. I also used a project called OpenDevin. And then lately I've kind of settled on Cloud Engineer, which does integrate with Bedrock. And so using all these tools, you're going to find out what works well and what's not working well. And what it comes down to, in my opinion, is being able to customize the agents to your use cases. So, which I found Cloud Engineer to be the best for that.
Have they added hooks now for Cloud Engineer for you to override the prompts, or is that still a thing where you're having to rebuild it based off the prompts that you're doing?
They have not done that yet, but what I've been doing is basically just cloning it, and then I have a separate project, and I'm able to make minimal changes to Cloud Engineer to have a separate tools file that kind of gets included. So they're little Python hacks and stuff that you can do to kind of get around the fact that it hasn't been built in a way that's extensible, but I still find it to be worth it.
All right. So where can people find out more about Matt Barlow and StratusGrid?
So for StratusGrid, definitely go to our website, stratusgrid.com, and we would be happy to talk with you if you're interested in implementing Gen AI or platform work or modernization or any of the offerings that we have. We'd love to talk with you about that. For me, you can follow me on github.com/mattbarlow-sg, and you'll see a link to all my recent blog posts and YouTube videos on that page, as well as my Twitter handle. Also, we have Stratosphere, which is our FinOps tool and can help you with cost management, especially if you are running multiple AWS accounts and want to be able to get an overview of different cost savings insights across all of them.
All right, Matt. It was awesome to talk to you. Hope you have a great day. Good luck with everything.
Thank you, James. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.
That's it for this episode of Data BS. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and not miss the next one. This episode was sponsored by Cordine, a data consultancy that helps organizations unlock the power of their data. If you have a data challenge, we can help. Visit cordine.com, CORRDYN.com, to learn more. See you next time.